Returning to our study of Islamic art and this idea of the Silk Road and trade, the Silk Road refers to one of the most trafficked and most important in terms of the transference of material culture and other aspects of culture, such as religion and beliefs, that occurred at this time. Why was it called the Silk Road? Um, the trajectory was, it covered many spots along the way, but its endpoints, broadly stated, ran from Rome, the Roman Empire, to China. All kinds of goods were exchanged. A lot of what China sent in Rome's direction was silk, hence the nomenclature, the name of the Silk Road: spices, animals, textiles. It also was a migratory pattern for religious beliefs. This really lovely plate with a Kufic border is from Samarkand, which in the map we just looked at is the northeastern corner of Uzbekistan. It's a shallow dish. Along its edges, the calligraphy is not a quotation that belongs to the Quran. It's an aphorism or a common saying. And like many other aphorisms, common sayings in Islam, in the Islamic language, it states an ordinary truth or a truism, and of course it had to be read. This one translates as, knowledge at the beginning of it is bitter to taste, but at the end, sweeter than honey. This points to a great emphasis, of course, on the idea of learning and knowledge and literacy on the behalf of this population. And we see this lovely stylization with these tall these tall emphasized vertical lines and these very clearly defined horizontals between them, creating this pattern for something that is just a ceramic plate that is composed of clay and methods of firing that were learned through the exchange of knowledge between China and other cultures, in this case, the Islamic culture. So it's a way of looking at the cultural fusing from these two different influences into a single object, and the deeply influencing way that trade extended to the exchange of religions as well as other cultural imports and exports. Having lived in one of those cultures on the Arabic Gulf Coast and doing some research for an exhibition, I came across many of these same kinds of aphorisms, some of which were quite amusing, and learning about how they had been utilized was also interesting. Again, this very important trade route of Islam and the converts that the Islamic faith, won through the Silk Road, as well as the trade exchange in which it engaged. The Alhambra Palace complex in Spain is one of the most, magnificent, impressive, even glorious of the world. And it's a wonderful emblematic idea and representation of the cohabitation or the sequential habitation of religions. In that, this palace complex was at times Islamic, secular, or under the rule of a Christian king. It consists of these complex open courtyards and gardens. Originally, it was conceived by Islamic Muslim builders, It features lush gardens that are encased in the palace, and it's got, as do many of these structures in the Islamic world, really ingenious ways of circulating light and air through enclosed spaces in what are, of course, quite hot climates. And the Romans had figured this out to a degree. Here too, we see the idea of gardens. If we think back to the Paradise Garden at Pompeii in Italy, the way that secular space is used, the idea of paradise and heaven, earth and heaven, the way, the significance that water held. We see that water divides these gardens into quadrants. And of course, in the Islamic faith, this idea of water as not just a substance or a surface, but something that is a moving um, substance and creates its own complement through those ripples, through its movement on its surface, creates complements to the fabric, so to speak, of the palace's architecture and arcades and rows. So you have this really rich visual as well as sensory through sound of changes in water composition that makes for not just an ornamental experience, and of course the visual one. There's also the idea that the eye can deceive us in terms of the way visuals are depicted. And here at this end of grouping of photos of the gardens and water bodies in the Court of the Lions, we see above this very intricately worked wasp-like structure. It almost looks like stalactites as an interesting architectural detail. And here with the muqarnas, these scooped out areas that are made out of stucco, right, out of plaster. Architecturally speaking, we can call this a vaulted feature. The baptistry of St. Louis from either Syria or Egypt is a brass object used to baptize children. This object, although made by Muslim silversmiths, was discovered in a Christian French church and used to baptize French kings and queens. Quite a remarkable object for several reasons. Although it may have been found on the banquet table of an Islamic ruler, we can see here that there are figures, animals, men on horsebacks. So not only would this have violated, right, the second commandment of the Christian 10 Commandments, this would also have violated the precepts of no images in Islamic faith. But because this was not used in a sacred space, but more likely in a palace, the context was not objectionable. But this sort of narration was never found in and not intended for a sacred space. There's a motif of hunting here with men on horseback, which leads the idea of its provenance, of its origins to Syria, in a symbolic sense, not necessarily literal. These sorts of items were, of course, easily transportable ones, being smaller, and the traffic between cultures could occur more easily. So this is an object that made its way into Europe, which had not seen anything quite like this before, and hence migrated from the workshop of an Islamic silversmith to an Islamic ruler's tables into a Christian church. We can here compare this narrative and subject-object storyline with those of others we've seen of men conducting a hunt here in chariots. Again, the spread of Islam through this long trajectory. The mihrab niche in the Qibla, the wall facing Mecca, a beautiful glazed tile of gold, blue, and white. The source for this beautiful blue tile, which is called lapis lazuli, was Afghanistan. Most certifiably, according to all the presented provenance to date. Afghanistan is the major source of lapis lazuli. It was then glazed, and this is not now in an original mosque, but in the Metropolitan Museum in Manhattan. Just this part of the mosque, a tile wall, which of course falls into the whole category today of, although as far as I know, this has not entered into these discussions of what belongs to whom, and many objects that were appropriated through colonialism being returned to their original owners. Again, this same beautiful and rich, dense, visual, dazzling display. On the furthest borders, we see calligraphy, as we do here, blue with white letters, and these symmetrical, iconic depictions, or rather representations of typical Islamic decorative work in the columns in between the two calligraphic borders. Moving into the last category in this chapter, the later empires, the Ottoman. And we can see where that culture in the upper part of our map is located. We have already visited the magnificent Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, now Istanbul. Many similar mosques are created during this time, and those who witnessed this Ottoman masterpiece wanted to make their own mosque. So other architecture that utilizes the same sort of minarets are added to the exterior. And to the interior, we have the addition of these hanging medallions. So this was an addition to the Hagia Sophia that was inspired by other architecture. The Hagia Sophia served as inspiration for a number of other structures. The Mosque of Sultan Selim in Turkey. And if we look at these details of, it has the same sort of replication of minarets, and this mosque is built slightly higher. The central plan is similar to the Hagia Sophia's, as we can see here, as is the interior. And these stunning views from the waterways, gazing upon these mosques, of which there are several in Istanbul today. The mosque central plan, very much inspired and influenced by the Hagia Sophia, these other structures. And domes. And again, looking at the difference in languages between a figurative representational image, like the one we see on the right, which is called the Christ Pantocrator, not relative to our study here, but in terms of lecture guides and testing, incidentally, but just as another example of, we have this huge Byzantine Christ, godlike, framing the dome of a church that happens to be in Italy and Sicily. And on the left, this ornamental, decorated, symmetrical dome. This very beautiful scripting that we also see, of course, in document works, calligraphic works on paper at this time. As we see here in the tugra, or the monogram, a signature, right, of the Sultan Suleiman. We see various spellings of Suleiman in Constantinople, in Istanbul, with the Suleiman Mosque. It's a varied spelling on this. This is ink and gold on paper, and quite a even a modernist to contemporary visual abstract representation. The Safavid Empire was one of the most important in Iran, formerly known as Persia. We have these differences between the Shia and Shiite religions, which has a lot to do with the power divides and controversy and warfaring in that part of the world today. Certainly in the Gulf Arabic countries, these are ongoing issues, violent ones, and warfaring, for thinking about Iran. The controversy in part has to do with who actually inherited the prophet's power, and this divides the two religious movements of the Sunni and the Shiite. In Iran today, anyway, there are more Shiites than Sunnis. In Iran, the Masjid-i-Shah, which is a park garden that and a water source that has been expanded into an enormous rectangular space seen here that includes a school or a madras, medical care. So the caretaking of the populace and the education of the populace is part of and the main activities of this complex, which is according to something called the 4 Iwan Plan. We see here the gateway, the mosque that starts beyond the first and adjacent to, just beyond, in the back of the first gateway at the end of this long drive. So it's not just a big civic part. Again, it has these functions of care, educational, medical, that pertain to the populace, the general diagram structure, and the water element we see here, now a bona fide, glorified water park, the Iwan or gateway, again with these sort of Muqarnas-like vaults at the top that look like wasps' nest. The blue gray glazed tile in the mihrab, seen here again. The Wagner, in German, the Wagner carpet is not a prayer carpet. It's a very large narrative carpet. A carpet that is intended for Islamic prayer would not contain um, as part of its subject line, animals, um, trees, fruit, as the Wagner carpet does. The context of the carpet in Islamic culture is crucial. It's sort of the center point. It's the hearth. In societies, in northern societies in many parts of the world, such as in Italy and Friuli, there's this funiculare that is a square hearth area, fire in the middle, and benches in this square all around it, where the family gathers every day, where meals are enjoyed and conversations are had. In Islam, the carpet was everything. In a sense, it was their architecture early on. If we think about the nomadic tribes, the Bedouins, this was part of the structure that included a tent. Within the tent, there is always a carpet. Wherever you go on your migratory route as a nomad, when you discover an oasis or you're still in the desert, you roll out the carpet when you get there and you build your temporary home life around that. Whether you're in a desert or a non-desert region. And here you can see these incredible details, right? Trees, shrubs, flowers, abundance, goats. The garden is always thought of in this culture as paradise. And again, so much commonality between cultures if we go back to those paradise gardens in Pompeii. In a palace, you could, in a very huge room, have this type of a carpet and walk in and look down and think about paradise. Not in a mosque, right? Because it has figurative elements to it. And again, it's a vast carpet. It's enormously impressive when you see it in real time. And just in closing on Islam, in terms of the carpet, if you are in the desert, say in Qatar or Qatar, which is a very small country that abuts Saudi Arabia on its only land side, and you go out into the desert for something like a falconry event, there will be huge tents set up, all sorts of food being served, no alcohol, of course, Islamic religion, and many sorts of cooling drinks. The falconry events are shown on a huge, like an outdoor movie screen, a huge outdoor screen, and under the tent's awning, there are chairs set up outside, and there are carpets out there in the middle of the desert. So perhaps not as lavish and as historically important as the Wagner carpet, but still an integral part today of Islamic culture.